In the endless screaming dark of the warp, where reality coils upon itself and emotion becomes form, there is an unsettling assumption that lingers unchallenged, that there are only 4 true gods: Khorne, Tzeentch, Nurgle, and Slaanesh, the ruinous powers, the baleful quartet who dominate the tides of unreality and revel in the torments of the mortal soul. But what if that certainty is a lie of omission? What if the immaterium once seethed with more? Gods now broken, consumed, or cast down into oblivion. The warp is not history. It is not linear, not honest, not whole. It is a graveyard of thought and a battlefield of gods born from belief, fear, hatred, and hope. And in such a place, how can we ever be sure that the thrones we see are the only ones that were ever built? Or that some ancient unknowable beings were not shattered and forgotten before the current pantheon ever whispered their first syllables of godhood? In this descent, we will peel back the illusions of the immaterium and ask a question that gnaws at the edges of sanity. Were there more warp gods? And if so, what happened to them? They did not come into being all at once. The 4 great chaos gods were not eternal. They were born, shaped, and fattened by the bleeding hearts of mortal species across eons. Each god is an emergent storm, a psychic conflagration given awareness by the billions of minds that fed it. Khorne arose from rage and bloodlust, Tzeentch from ambition and change, Nurgle from despair and acceptance, and Slaanesh, last to rise, from the ecstasies and agonies of unchecked indulgence. Their births were not divine events, but catastrophes of collective emotion, cosmic responses to the psychic pollution of sentient life. Yet even in their monumental ascent, a shadow remains. They are not so much rulers of the warp as they are its loudest echoes, and echoes imply originals. Khorne was likely the first to stir. As primitive sentients tore one another apart, as the first wars echoed across stone and sand, a great psychic pressure built up in the warp. The brutal logic of dominance, the purity of violence, the sacrifice of self for the thrill of killing. These concepts aggregated and pulsed until something snapped. And in that moment, Khorne bellowed his first cry. But even then, it is hard not to imagine that the warp had already known other hungers, other blades. Was Khorne the first god of war, or just the one that endured? Tzeentch's rise is more subtle, a slow bloom of madness and desire. As knowledge spread, as lies and dreams fermented in the minds of scholars, tyrants, and witches, the warp coalesced this complexity into the ever-shifting form of the Changer of Ways. But even his earliest sigils bear an alien flair, as if inheriting a tradition rather than inventing it. Could Tzeentch be a successor, a grandchild of a god of knowledge now forgotten, one who crumbled under the weight of too many contradictory truths? Nurgle, by contrast, is the cold inevitability of rot made beautiful. His laughter is born from hopelessness, from the quiet surrender to death. During dark ages of plague and famine, the god who would be Nurgle grew fat on misery until he embraced those who welcomed their end. Yet the way his power binds decay and affection together, how he unites entropy and joy, suggests he is not a primordial force, but a reinterpretation. Perhaps even a parasite on a dead god of healing, now twisted into his own grotesque antithesis. Then there is Slaanesh, youngest and most violent in their birth. The psychic collapse of the Eldar during the fall did not create Slaanesh out of nothing. It merely allowed their embryonic form to erupt into full godhood. But whispers in the warp suggest that Slaanesh gestated long before the fall, nurtured not only by the Eldar, but by humanity's own decadence, by the sadistic joy of forgotten empires and unspeakable cults. Were there others, beings of lust, of artistry, of void-born music, who were devoured or subsumed by Slaanesh's birth scream? Each of these gods bears signs of absorption. They are not clean manifestations, but amalgams, layered with contradictions, clothed in stolen myths. They feel less like singular gods and more like cannibalistic entities, feasting on the psychic husks of others to expand their domains. Khorne's discipline echoes a forgotten god of honor. Tzeentch's obsession with plans hints at a deity of order gone rogue. Nurgle's delight in growth through suffering mocks a healer turned cruel. Slaanesh's hunger for sensation feels like a choir singing over a silenced soloist, and all of them may be squatting upon thrones built from bones we have never seen. The mere fact that these gods emerged from mortal emotion is the greatest hint that they are not unique. Emotions are infinite, layered, subtle. Where are the gods of mourning, of solitude, of wonder? Where is the deity of mercy, of rebellion without chaos, of loyalty without rage? The known four are archetypes, but they do not exhaust the possibilities. They are the survivors of an unseen selection, the victors of a war not only for power, but for conceptual territory. And that should terrify us. For if these four arose through sheer psychic resonance, and if they were not the first, then others may still be possible, or worse, others may have been unmade. Their supremacy is built on graves. And the warp remembers. The warp is littered with secrets too vast for mortal comprehension, but in its swirling madness, there remain hints, faint myths, half-remembered symbols, and broken names that cling to the edges of reality like phantoms. These are not the domains of Khorne or Tzeentch, nor whispers of Nurgle or Slaanesh. They are different, older, stranger, and possibly extinct. Scholars of the forbidden and mad seers speak of these remnants, these almost gods, with a kind of terrified reverence, as if speaking them aloud might cause them to remember themselves and return. There is the tale of the Eighth Spiral, an ancient warp glyph unearthed in the ruins of a shattered Eldar craft world. It spoke of a god of recursion and endless reflection, a being whose power was introspection so deep it folded time inward. No name is ever attached, only a symbol, a mirrored spiral with a jagged cut through the center. It's said that to truly understand the glyph is to be trapped in your own mind until your psychic echo tears itself apart. Was this a god of paradox, of selfhood? Among the shattered moons of Vexlar Drift, deep in the Ghoul stars, rogue traders found pre-imperial etchings of a four-eyed entity surrounded by stylized flames that rise, not fall. The name, untranslatable, sounds something like Orkelhen, and the emotion encoded in the glyphs was not rage or ambition, but revelation. What kind of being fed on moments of catastrophic truth? A god of apocalypse not through destruction, but through knowing? Then there are human myths, those that slipped through censorship and inquisitorial flames. In the rust-blackened archives of Moritat Prime, a cult once worshipped a being they called the Hollow Womb. It was not a god of love or lust, but of yearning, the scream of unfulfilled desire, the mourning for unborn futures. Its devotees wore veils and never spoke aloud. The cult was exterminated, of course, but their liturgies remained, verses that sound eerily like a god that never quite lived, but waited endlessly for a worship that never came. Even the Adeptus Mechanicus whispers of forgotten machine spirits, too vast and too sentient to be mere data loops. The Omnissiah is sacrosanct, but in the vaults of Mars, there are rumors of a presence known as the Logic That Hungers, a data entity so rational it consumed irrational gods by converting their emotions into pure function. It is never spoken of as alive, only as a process. And perhaps that's what it once was, a god of pure clarity, erased by the chaos that abhors certainty. The Harud, those ancient entropy-warping Xenos, may carry echoes of a dead god in their incessant decay. Their time-warping fugue states and the psychic drain they impose on reality feel less like a biological quirk and more like a eulogy to something larger. Eldar lexicons call this absence Ulnsho, the sigh between moments, perhaps not a god, but a loss so profound it became semi-aware, a scar across the warp's surface. In each case, we find fragments, names half said, symbols erased or distorted. emotions that don't fit cleanly into the quadrants of the ruinous powers. These are not elaborations of Khorne or mutations of Slaanesh. They feel alien, stand alone, and yet they are absent, not dead in the usual sense, but nullified, made myth, made silence. The immaterium is defined by psychic resonance. If a god vanishes completely, with no one left to remember, believe, or fear it, then it becomes unmade. Yet these traces endure, signs that someone, somewhere, once believed in something else. Perhaps these gods were slain in battles too ancient to recall. Perhaps they starved, forgotten and prayerless. Or perhaps, chillingly, they were erased by force, removed from all history by the victors of a divine purge. Whatever the case, these myths are more than footnotes. They are warnings. They remind us that the four we know today are not the only shapes the warp can take. They are merely those that claim the crown and wear it still. But even thrones cast long shadows, and in those shadows forgotten gods may still whisper. The immaterium is not merely a sea of emotion, it is a realm of predation. Warp entities do not coexist. They devour, subsume, annihilate. And so, if there were other gods, and all signs point to the possibility, then it follows that they may have perished not by entropy or neglect, but by war. Not metaphorical war, but the primal, horrific, god-eating war of the immaterium, where belief is both weapon and shield, and to lose is to be erased from every layer of perception. We can only guess at the battles that might have taken place. But when we consider how much raw power flows through even the minor demons of the current pantheon, how much devastation can be wrought by a single greater demon of Khorne or Tzeentch, the mind reels at the idea of God versus God, entities of such psychic density that their clashes would create warp storms across reality, rupture stars, or perhaps even erase timelines. A war among the gods would not just reshape the immaterium, it would burn away parts of the material universe as collateral. Some scholars of the heretical grimoires describe what they call the First Silence, a theoretical prehistory of the warp when it was not dominated by the current four, but by a kaleidoscope of beings, each vying for conceptual supremacy. In this vision, gods rose and fell like storms. Some held dominion over primal concepts, hunger, light, memory, while others embodied alien thoughts we cannot translate. One theory suggests that as the warp became more populated, its own laws changed, favoring emotional extremes over subtler expressions. Thus, the gods of curiosity, patience, or balance were not simply outcompeted. They were slaughtered by more brutal, ravenous beings. It is not impossible to imagine Khorne carving his domain from the corpse of a god of martial honor. Imagine the clash, honor, restraint, and disciplined violence pitted against raw, furious carnage. In such a war, Khorne's disdain for weakness would drive him to consume, to obliterate, until nothing remained but the howling joy of bloodshed. What was once a god of duels and ritual could be shattered, its noble rites twisted into the brutal mantras of the blood god. Tzeentch, in his insidious brilliance, may not have fought with claws or fire. He would have schemed, ensnared, turned rival gods against each other. Perhaps he whispered truths so corrosive they undid his enemies from within. A god of stability or reason might crumble in a tide of madness, their essence unmade by doubt. Where once stood a guardian of cosmic equilibrium, now only the gibbering fractals of Tzeentch's realm remain. Nurgle's victory would be slower, more intimate. He would not slay his rivals outright, but infect them. Gods of hope or perseverance could be drowned in malaise, their domains eaten away by despair. Nurgle does not destroy. He enfolds, corrupts, and eventually replaces. In a war of attrition, even divinities fall to rot. Slaanesh, born in an explosion of sensation, may have been less a general and more a cataclysm. But what if their coming was not the first? What if the rise of Slaanesh was preceded by skirmishes, with gods of beauty, of creativity, of subtle pleasure? gods who tried to maintain artistic dignity against the tidal wave of Slaanesh's hunger, only to be torn apart, their melodies drowned in the sensual scream. There are demonic fossils in the lore, remnants that feel like leftovers from gods who no longer exist. Some demons do not cleanly match their god's theme or shift allegiances in inexplicable ways. Perhaps these are echoes, survivals of dead pantheons now forced to serve their killers. Perhaps the warp still mourns in its own twisted way the destruction of its former children. This theoretical war in the immaterium would be more than chaos. It would be annihilation of the highest order, the ultimate form of natural selection, where gods fight not for dominion alone, but for the right to exist. The four we know today are not merely powerful, they are survivors of genocide. A genocide of the divine, waged not for justice or balance, but for supremacy of thought. And so the silence around these lost gods becomes suspect. It is not the silence of the unknown, it is the silence of the erased. A war of this scale would not leave stories. It would leave only fear, only thrones built atop dust, only echoes denied their source. In the deepest rifts of the immaterium, among currents that churn with raw thought and shattered memory, there are places where nothing stirs. No demon hunts, no gods watch, no dreams reach. These voids are not natural, they are deliberate. And some warp seers call them the hollow thrones. To stand near such a space psychically, even for a moment, is to feel absence so profound it bleeds into pain. It is the silence of a scream that once shook the cosmos, now cut off mid-note. These hollow thrones are not merely metaphorical. Demonologists have described them, forbidden accounts retrieved from broken minds and unlisted vaults. A throne is not just a seat of power in the warp, but a resonance point, a convergence where a god's conceptual frequency reaches its peak. The four known gods have thrones. Khorne's brass seat atop his mountain of skulls, Tzeentch's ever-morphing crystalline spire, Nurgle's rotting garden, Slaanesh's impossible palace of excess. But there are thrones that sit unclaimed, thrones whose emotional resonance is detectable, yet from which no presence speaks. One of these is said to be carved of obsidian that bleeds light, not shadow. It vibrates with loss, a pure, aching sense of something missing, something stolen. Psychers who brush against it suffer immediate grief for things they cannot name, siblings never born, homes never built, futures never lived. This has led some to believe that the god who once sat there was tied to destiny, perhaps a deity of paths not taken, of potentiality, a god not of what is, but what could have been. Another hollow throne pulses with hunger, but not for food or flesh. It is the hunger of identity, the desperate thirst to be seen, to be known. A few esoteric tomes suggest this was the seat of a god of recognition, of memory, one whose domain was not power but remembrance, and whose death rendered entire civilizations forgettable. Perhaps their annihilation is why certain ages of history feel unnaturally vague, as if deliberately blurred by something more than time. There are thrones that radiate fear not aligned with Khorne's rage or Nurgle's despair. One radiates awe, not reverence, but existential dread in the face of beauty so intense it annihilates the self. Scholars dare not approach this one in meditative trance, for it is said to drive the mind to recursive self-erasure. Could it have belonged to a god of transcendence, of beauty unbound by sanity? If so, it suggests that even divinity tied to awe can be silenced. What is most terrifying about these thrones is not that they are empty, but that they remain. The warp does not waste space, it consumes. Yet these seats persist, implying that their original holders were not consumed in the traditional sense. They were exorcised, removed so violently that their essence could not be repurposed, only rejected. The immaterium, for all its entropy and hunger, still honors something, some law or balance that forbids reoccupying these places. Or perhaps the gods themselves dare not take them, fearing what memory might return if they did. And there is the implication, dark and thrilling, that these thrones might be claimed again, that the right psychic storm, the right cult, the right mass sacrifice, or galactic convulsion could reignite a throne long dead. That a god could be reborn, not from the void, but from its own forgotten legacy. A being not new, but returned. A revenant deity, not dreaming, but waiting. In such a context, the four gods' silence on these matters becomes damning. They never acknowledge the thrones. Their demons do not speak of them. But perhaps that is not ignorance. Perhaps it is fear. For even gods can be haunted. And there may be no fear greater than the return of a peer one thought destroyed. A god who remembers and wants back what was stolen. The hollow thrones are monuments to annihilation. They are wounds in the warp that refuse to heal. They do not whisper, they do not pulse. But they are not gone. And something in the stillness, something in the shape of that silence, feels like waiting. Of all the heresies whispered in darkened corners of the galaxy, few are as tantalizing or as blasphemous as the shattered god theory. It is not a tale of creation nor a myth of emergence. It is a murder mystery, a divine assassination. The idea that the four chaos gods as we know them are not separate beings birthed from disparate emotions, but the scattered remnants of a single primal god of the warp, a titan so immense in concept and power that it fractured under the strain of mortal minds, birthing its killers in the process. This theory holds that the earliest psychic stirrings of the galaxy coalesced not into many, but into one supreme warp entity, a being that embodied the totality of mortal emotion, joy and sorrow, rage and peace, ambition and fear, all in perfect, terrible balance. A god of everything, of passion itself. Such a being would have been beyond comprehension, a singularity of consciousness whose presence reshaped the fabric of the warp just by existing. It may not have had form or even name because it didn't need one. It simply was. But the mortal mind cannot grasp totality. Our psyches are fragmented, limited, hungry for division. As more species reached psychic maturity, as their collective unconscious screamed into the immaterium, they did not feed this whole god. They tore at it, pulled it in different directions. One species' hatred poisoned another's sorrow. One empire's need for control clashed with another's yearning for release. And the god began to splinter. From its fracture lines poured raw, unbound aspects of itself. The martial fury became Korn. The desperate cunning, Tzeentch. The rot of decay, Nurgle. The hedonistic scream, Slaanesh. None of them are whole. They are shards, each clinging to a portion of the original god's concept. And yet, because mortals are themselves fragmented, these shards found resonance. They became powerful, worshipped, fed. What then happened to the original? Some say it still exists, not dead, but broken, its awareness shattered and scattered across the domains of the four. Others claim it is truly gone, annihilated by the psychic violence of its own children. And a darker version of the theory suggests that the four are not only its offspring, but its jailers. That the primal god is bound beneath the warp, screaming in silence, with each of the four feeding on its eternal suffering to maintain their own existence. The root of all chaos, buried under layers of lies and ritual, evidence for this theory is maddeningly circumstantial. Ancient warp echoes that seem to scream four names at once. Demons that speak of the one before tearing out their own tongues. The impossible unity sometimes found in unsanctioned warp rituals, where summoners aiming for Slaanesh find themselves touched by visions of battle, plague, or deceit. As if the gods are still trying, or forced, to remember their origin. Even more disturbing are the mortals who claim partial communion with this lost god. Most burn out instantly, their minds unable to process the overlapping emotions. A few survive, deranged prophets whose words make no linear sense but carry a terrifying weight of truth. One such seer, incarcerated deep beneath the black ships, painted the same sigil on every wall of her cell, a perfect circle broken in 4 jagged directions, a symbol of unity undone. If this theory holds even a grain of truth, then the implications are vast. It suggests that the gods we fear are not just archetypes of destruction and madness, they are wounded things, incomplete. Their rage and hunger might not be essential traits, but the symptoms of a deeper loss. They lash out not because they are evil, but because they are broken, and in their pain, they perpetuate their own fragmentation. Could they be healed? Could the original god return, reconsolidated by some catastrophic event or act of mass will? Or would that reunion destroy everything? A psychic singularity that consumes both warp and materium in a final divine implosion. The shattered god theory is not widely known, and where it is known, it is feared. It challenges the dogma not just of the Imperium, but of the demonic powers themselves. It is a theory that suggests the very nature of chaos is not primordial, but traumatic, not absolute, but fractured, and that the gods we think of as eternal might, in the end, be no more than fragments clinging desperately to a past they themselves destroyed. The fall of the Eldari was not the birth of Slaanesh. It was its scream of arrival. But like any scream, it had echoes, and those echoes may speak of others who came before. To believe that Slaanesh was the first warp entity shaped by desire is to mistake the detonation for the powder keg. The psychic saturation of pleasure, pain, vanity, and perfection did not appear from nowhere. The Eldari, with their millennia of unchecked indulgence, were not the first to taste forbidden ecstasies. They were merely the most efficient and the most arrogant. Ancient Eldar myths, preserved in corrupted fragments or echoed in the paranoid whispers of surviving exodites, speak of presences in the warp that felt too close to Slaanesh and yet too alien. Entities of rhythm and resonance, not gods of lust but of art, not destroyers but seducers of the soul, beings who existed to refine sensation, not gorge on it. It said that one such entity, perhaps called Shavkael, was a whisper in the warp, adored by the earliest elder poets. But Shavkael is no longer named in the Craftworld libraries. Every mention was either lost in the cataclysm of the fall or erased deliberately. Could it be that Slaanesh consumed not just their birthright, but their rivals? Before Slaanesh rose in glory and horror, there may have been many minor warp entities feeding on the psychic runoff of cultures obsessed with aesthetic extremes. A human noble who orchestrated symphonies that ended in madness may have unknowingly fed such an entity. An orc obsessed not with war, but with the color and rhythm of destruction might have unintentionally contributed. These proto-deities would have been vulnerable, not yet true gods, not yet stabilized by a singular emotional vector. And when the psychic detonation of the Eldari minds birthed Slaanesh, it would have been like a black hole of sensuality, drawing all similar frequencies into itself. The cults that survived the fall speak of this differently. Among the Drukhari who escaped into the webway, there are tales of the 80 cries, songs that once summoned different demonic muses, each tied to a unique mode of pleasure or artistry. After the fall, all 80 fell silent. Slaanesh, in rising, did not merely emerge. She replaced, she erased, she devoured every lesser thing that might have claimed a similar domain. It is worth considering how long Slaanesh gestated before their true awakening. The psychic event that birthed them was triggered by the Eldari's descent into unimaginable hedonism, but the god did not spark into life instantly. The immaterium was already shifting, vibrating with the waves of excess and exploration. During that gestation period, countless smaller entities may have briefly thrived, momentary gods, each dancing on the razor-thin cusp of individuality and annihilation. They were not failures, they were appetizers. Even within humanity's own history before the Age of Strife, There were pleasure cults and synesthetic visionaries whose records hint at contact with demonic presences that do not neatly align with Slaanesh's iconography. Some of these beings praised self-denial as a higher form of sensation. Others existed solely within dreams, communicating through color and taste, never speech. Where are they now? Gone or digested? Did Slaanesh not just rise, but consume the ladder upon which they climbed? The question that arises is chilling. Was Slaanesh the inevitable result of psychic saturation in pleasure? Or were they the chosen, the victor among many, perhaps even engineered by the warp itself to consolidate and streamline that domain? The gods of chaos are not merely emotional responses, they are filters. Slaanesh might be the end product of a long process of distillation, where all other expressions of rapture, suffering, vanity, and excess were refined into one overwhelming form. And so the cacophony that once filled the warp with varied voices of art and sensation has become a single dominant chorus. One god to rule them, one god to absorb them, one god whose beauty masks an act of mass divinity side. Slaanesh did not just claim their place. They stole a kingdom already built, already populated. They are the echo of 1,000 forgotten screams. And when they moan in pleasure, what we hear may be the muffled death rattles of all the others who came before. In the farthest reaches of forgotten lore, amid the torn pages and scorched glyphs of heretical texts, there exists a name that is both forbidden and fractured: Malal. Or as some more cryptically refer to it, Malice. A god of anarchy, betrayal, and self-destruction. A being whose very concept is rebellion against the established pantheon, not against mortals, but against its fellow gods. And in that defiance lies the core of a theory more dangerous than most, that Malal or entities like it are the remnants of lost gods, or perhaps even survivors, hiding in the cracks left by chaos itself. Malal is an enigma even by warp standards. Where the four thrive on mortals, feeding, corrupting, rewarding, Malal's doctrine, where known, seems to urge the destruction of chaos from within. His diamonds do not build temples or seduce minds, they sabotage. They whisper doubt into the ears of other gods' followers. They devour the essence of their own kind. It is the ultimate paradox. A chaos god who despises chaos, who exists only to undo the system that birthed him. And that, more than anything else, may be why Malal was exiled, not simply forgotten. What makes Malal compelling is the idea that his existence suggests a time when the current pantheon was not yet absolute. A time when gods could challenge each other ideologically, not merely with raw power. If Malal once walked openly in the warp, he represents the possibility of dissent among the divine, of a god refusing the pact of shared dominion. Perhaps Malal once sat at the same level as Khorne and Sench, only to be cast out in a war of metaphysical politics, where the price of refusal was erasure. Some heretics believe Malal was not born as an enemy, but became one through betrayal. A fifth god, perhaps of contradiction or duality, who saw too late what the warp was becoming, and chose annihilation over participation. Others whisper that Malal is what remains of an ancient god who tried to contain the others, to restrain chaos, only to be unmade and twisted by the very thing it sought to control. In that reading, Malal is not a rebel. He is a jailer who failed. There are those who conflate Malal with another fringe presence, the anathema. Not the emperor's self-proclaimed title, but an idea that in the deep warp, there exists a being so antithetical to all other chaos that its presence nullifies warp constructs. It has no name, no form, only a hole, a void that unravels demons, silences psychic screams, and resists corruption not through purity, but through counter-chaos. Could this be Malal reborn? Or another lost god? A hidden guardian theory calls the last survivor of a defeated pantheon. Even among chaos cults, there are occasional schisms, bloody divisions that end in self-destruction, not rivalry. Some historians argue that these internecine cult wars echo Malal's influence, that somewhere in the psyche of chaos lies a remnant meme, a virus of revolt implanted by a god who once declared war on the very concept of obedience, and that this god, though officially erased from scripture, is still active in the warp's blind spots, feeding on treachery and philosophical heresy. The most frightening possibility, however, is not that Malal is real, but that he is only partly real. A half-dead god, a mimetic ghost, a psychic echo that cannot fully manifest because the current pantheon maintains a metaphysical monopoly. But if cracks ever widen, if one of the four were to fall, or if the belief in chaos as it currently stands ever falters, then Malal might not need worshippers to return. He might simply resume speaking, and he would not be alone. Malal may be the name we have, but he may be one of many. Echoes of forgotten gods who do not seek to rule, but to unmake. To cast down the thrones and grind the architecture of the warp into dust. They are not gods of hatred or blood, not gods of pleasure or change. They are gods of negation, of endings. The warp, so full of life and madness, may yet carry within it the seeds of its own antithesis. The beast of the forge, as some call it, may not scream or roar, but simply dismantle, slowly, quietly, completely. Not with fire, but with silence. How does a god die? Not in the way mortals understand death, not through old age or injury. Warp entities are constructs of belief, emotional resonance, and psychic echo. To kill a god is to destroy the thing it represents in the minds of its worshippers, to unmake the concepts that sustain it. But there is another, darker possibility, that gods can be killed not only by forgetting, but by betrayal, by being consumed from within, by being offered to rivals in exchange for power, or obliterated in acts of psychic treason too vast for comprehension. The fates of the lost ones, the gods whose thrones now sit hollow or whose echoes we only barely perceive, must have been varied, each one a tragedy in its own right. Some may have been overwhelmed in battle, their forms shattered by a greater god's onslaught. Others might have faded slowly, starved of attention, their once vibrant domains cannibalized by encroaching rivals. A god of peace, for example, may have watched its worshippers turn to Tzeentch's manipulations for a quicker end to war, or to Khorne's bloodlust for definitive resolution. The god of peace wouldn't rage. It would weep, and then it would disappear. Some gods may have been devoured not through conquest, but through assimilation. Picture a god of despair who once ruled quietly in the dark. Their followers, numbed by centuries of pain, began turning toward the grotesque comfort of Nurgle. The god of despair watched helpless as their sorrow turned into acceptance, into laughter, into rot, until the difference between them blurred, and Nurgle, always greedy for resonance, absorbed the last of the smaller god's essence, not through violence but through transmutation. The warp is not just emotional, it is relational. A god does not exist in isolation, but through the dynamic of worship, fear, hatred, and hope. Remove any part of that, shift it subtly, and the god begins to unravel. Many of the lost ones may have died by dilution. Their worshippers didn't renounce them, they just shifted allegiance slightly, just enough. A god of rebellion might wither when its followers begin to rebel, not for freedom, but for chaos. A god of dreams might collapse when its visionaries start dreaming of domination instead of liberation. And there are crueler endings still. Some dead gods may have been sacrificed by their own servants. In moments of desperation, entire cults may have offered up their deity's name, essence, and throne to the rising powers in exchange for survival or transformation. A god of balance, betrayed by its own monks, given as tribute to Tzeentch in return for knowledge. A goddess of twilight, sold to Slaanesh by a dying civilization craving eternal dusk. In these moments, godhood does not end with a fight. It ends with a deal, a bargain, a seduction, and the screams of the betrayed echo longest in the warp. Others may have been silenced by something deeper. Not war, not treachery, but the sheer entropy of the warp itself. The immaterium is not a passive sea. It changes, it evolves. The psychic landscape of 10,000 years ago is not the same as today. A god of certainty might have thrived in an age of logic and unity, only to crumble as the galaxy descended into madness. A god of sacrifice might vanish when all cultures begin to treat martyrdom as madness. In such cases, the gods do not fall. They dissolve, quietly, tragically. But there's a darker thought that haunts this question. What if some gods were erased, not just forgotten, but made unthinkable? What if the current pantheon, in its rise, found ways to expunge rival concepts from the warp entirely, cutting out domains that could never rise again? Imagine a divine war not just of flame and claw, but of rewriting reality itself, removing ideas, making certain thoughts impossible. That is the final death. Not obliteration, but unbeing. This is why the thrones remain hollow but not refilled. These are not vacancies. They are crimes, mass graves of thought, proof that gods can be unmade, not just destroyed, but unraveled so thoroughly that even their death is a secret. And yet, in the warp, nothing is ever truly gone. Not completely. Not. Perhaps their fates were not final. Perhaps in dreams and madness, in the slipstream between thoughts, they wait. Not alive, not dead, but unfinished. To speak of chaos is often to speak of humanity. Not because mankind birthed the warp, that impossibility lies far beyond human reach, but because humanity has come to define it in the current age. The psychic resonance of the human species, with its volatile blend of contradiction, emotion, and scale, has shaped the warp in ways more profound than any other race. But what if that shaping was not just additive, but destructive? What if humanity, in its raw psychic adolescence, is the very force that killed the other gods? No species has ever burned across the stars quite like mankind. In mere millennia, it has gone from crawling across Terra's soil to dominating 1,000,000 worlds. Its psychic awakening, though slow, has grown exponential. Billions of souls flicker and scream in the warp every day. Wars, betrayals, hopes, tragedies, all feed the immaterium. But this raw, unfiltered chaos may not have allowed for subtlety. Where the Eldar sculpted the warp with decadent precision, humanity floods it with overwhelming emotion. And in doing so, it may have drowned quieter gods. Consider the human tendency toward extremes. There is no room in the warp, it seems, for a god of moderation or balance or reflection. Such gods would be overwhelmed by the binary excesses of humanity's spiritual output, glory and despair, conquest and subjugation, dogma and heresy. In the constant psychic noise generated by the human species, there is little space for nuance. It is possible that gods once worshipped by older, quieter civilizations simply ceased to resonate. Not because they failed, but because they were crowded out. But more terrifying is the possibility that humanity did more than drown them, that it hunted them. The rise of the imperial cult, with its rigid theology and violently enforced dogma, has turned the psychic ecosystem of mankind into a scorched battlefield. Any belief not aligned with the Emperor, the God Emperor, is declared heresy. And heresy is not just suppressed, it is annihilated. Cults are burned, myths are erased, languages die, symbols are forbidden. Across 10,000 years, entire pantheons could have been erased from human thought by inquisitorial decree. And if belief shapes the warp, then this is psychic genocide. Even the Emperor's own psychic shadow may have played a role. As the anathema, his very presence in the warp is a blade against its denizens. But a blade cuts more than its target. Could the Emperor, in his hubris or strategy, have culled the warp of rival gods, not only chaos but all others, to clear the field for mankind? Was his goal not just to dominate the material, but to sterilize the immaterium? And then there is the unspoken horror. What if humanity's own mythic structures are designed to prevent new gods? The Imperium teaches that there is one God, one truth, one vision. But even within chaos cults, the human mind tends to consolidate. It finds the four and stops there. Even heretics rarely worship outside the prescribed pantheon. Perhaps that is not coincidence. Perhaps the architecture of belief in the human soul, shaped by 10,000 years of repression and fear, has become a prison, a design to keep other gods from ever being born. The Eldar once had a vibrant pantheon. The Orcs treat their twin gods as part of their Gestalt war instinct. The Hrud have fugue lords. The Kroot speak of the Eaters of Form. But humanity? Humanity sees only four shapes in the dark. Four gods, in whom all sin and power are categorized. Anything else is deemed unthinkable. That is not imagination. That is indoctrination on a psychic level. So when we ask how other gods died, we must look inward. Not just to demons or rival gods, but to humanity itself. To our fear, to our faith, to our need for control, for order, for hierarchy. We may not have killed the other gods with fire and blade. We may have done something worse. We forgot them. We deleted them. We denied them space in our dreams. And in the warp, that is death. Beyond the teeming expanse of the Imperium, past the war-torn worlds and ravaged stars, lies a truth often ignored by humanity. We are not the only species who dream, fear, and believe. Other minds cry into the warp. Other souls, alien, ancient, and strange, have carved their echoes into the immaterium. And in those echoes, we find the possibility that chaos is not just a human narrative, but a contested landscape shaped by Xenos gods, Xenos fears, and Xenos deaths. The Eldar are the most tragic example. Their pantheon was once vast, nuanced, and intimately tied to the warp. From the warlike Kala-Mensha Kane to the laughing trickster Segorak, the Eldar gods were more than metaphors. They were warp-anchored realities. And yet most are gone. Kane was shattered by Slaanesh, his fragments scattered across the galaxy. Morai Heg and Liliath were devoured or destroyed. Only Segorak endures, dancing between the cracks. But what if the Eldar gods were not just separate from the Chaos Pantheon? What if they were parallel to it? Rivals? What if their deaths were not tragic accidents, but strategic cullings? Slaanesh's birth alone is evidence that a god can rise by annihilating others. When the Prince of Pleasure erupted from the psychic collapse of the Elder race, it didn't merely enter the warp, it consumed. The Elder gods, long seated in the immaterium, were torn apart not as concepts, but as prey. The God-Eater aspect of Slaanesh hints at a deeper reality, that warp entities can grow not only through belief, but through cannibalism. If this happened to the Elder Pantheon, why not others? The Orcs are another anomaly. Their gods, Gork and Mork, do not behave like the traditional warp gods. They exist in a hybrid state, partially warp, partially Gestalt projection. Born from the collective psychic echo of the Orcoid species, they embody brute cunning and cunning brutality. And they endure. Not because they are stronger, but because the Orcs believe in them with perfect, unquestioning certainty. The simplicity of Orc psychic energy protects their gods, not just from death, but from dilution. Could this be the key? That purity of belief can shield a god from the internecine warfare of the warp. Then there are the Hrud, whose psychic presence is almost parasitic. Their warp interactions suggest they may serve, or remember, a god of entropy, of decline, of rot deeper than even Nurgle. The so-called fugue lords, glimpsed only in collapsing timelines and entropy storms, might be survivors of a pantheon that predates even the old ones. Yet no name remains, no prayers, just instinctive entropy. A death god too old for language, remembered only in decay. The Kroot, who evolved through the consumption of DNA, whisper of gods who once taught them to eat dreams, entities not of flesh, but of psychic sustenance. Some shapers believe their ancestors consumed a warp entity, not a demon, but a god, and that this act changed the direction of Kroot evolution forever. That god's name, if it existed, is gone, but its echo may still ripple through Kroot genetic memory, appearing in flashes of ritual and trance. Even the Tau, who lack psychic presence in the traditional sense, once encountered a Xenos race during their early expansion that worshipped what they called the Nameless Flow, a being of fate, of convergence. The race is gone, the record scrubbed, but Tau archaeologists uncovered symbols that resonate with known warp patterns. A god not of war, not of decay, but of inevitable paths. Silenced, perhaps, before it could fully awaken, these Xenos pantheons tell us something vital, that the warp is not a monolith. It is a battlefield of ideas, shaped by all sentient life. The Four dominate now not because they are supreme, but because they won. And perhaps not even that, perhaps because their competition was fragmented, tribal, and vulnerable. Chaos as we know it may be a consequence of consolidation, a divine monopoly enforced through psychic imperialism. So the question becomes not whether other gods lived, but whether they could live again. If the Eldar resurrect Aeneid, their god of the dead, will it stand apart from chaos or be absorbed? If the Hrud coalesce into new mythic structures, will their gods return? If humanity ever truly falls, will new species rise to fill the silence? The warp has no borders, but belief creates boundaries. And the pantheon of chaos is not inevitable. It is the result of countless genocides, not of people but of gods. And somewhere, in the souls of alien minds, the seeds of rebellion might yet bloom. In the deep immaterium, where no light reaches and time is only an insult, there are regions of such unnatural stillness that even demons dare not pass. These are not voids in the traditional sense. They are not places without form or meaning. They are containers, vaults, and within them perhaps lies a truth more terrifying than death, that some gods are not gone, but sleeping. The idea of a dormant warp entity is often dismissed as superstition. Gods, after all, are sustained by emotion. If that emotion fades, they fade. But what if that emotion is not extinguished, merely transformed? What if the god does not die, but falls into torpor, waiting for the right psychic climate to reawaken? The warp is shaped by belief, but belief is cyclical. A concept fallen out of favor today may be reborn tomorrow. And if that concept was once divine, it may bring its god with it. There are myths, forbidden, scattered, of entities who once ruled parts of the immaterium that no longer map to the current chaos domains. Places of obsidian glass, where memory itself flowed like rivers. Places of black flame, where language had weight. Some scholars speak of the three-eyed choir, a god of harmony between conflicting truths, banished not for weakness, but for making too much sense. Its last breath was a lullaby of contradiction that caused a warp storm to dream itself out of existence. And then there are the signs, psychic anomalies where demons lose cohesion, where known gods cannot extend their influence. Warp tides that move against all predictive models, converging toward dead ends with no obvious power at the center. These are sometimes labeled as random, but in the warp, randomness is a lie. Everything flows from something. Perhaps what it flows from is asleep, dreaming itself back into relevance. The rituals of certain lost cults also hint at this idea. The Obsidian Requiem, a blasphemous tome lost during the Nova Terra interregnum, speaks of the one who waits under emotion, a being not fed by worship, but by silence. Its domain was said to be absence, not apathy, but the void left behind when faith collapses. And it dreams not in images, but in potential futures. Each mortal who doubts their God, who turns from worship, is a breath that may stir the sleeper. What makes this concept horrifying is not merely the idea that old gods sleep. It is that we may already be waking them, unknowingly. As belief in the existing pantheon becomes rote, as mortals lose faith in even chaos, the old pressures shift. Cults fracture. New fears arise. The emotional landscape of the galaxy changes, and so too must the warp. And the beings who once reigned during a different age may feel that tide and begin to stir. Worse still, what if the known gods fear this? Perhaps this is why Khorne rages ever louder, why Tzeentch's schemes become more frenzied, why Nurgle's rot accelerates, and Slaanesh's hungers become more profane. Not because they are in control, but because they are terrified of losing it. Because somewhere in the infinite mirror of the warp, they feel eyes opening. Not rival gods, ancients, originals. There is a popular heresy among certain radical navigators, those who've stared too long into the Empyrean and returned alive but altered. They speak of the pulse, a hidden rhythm felt during transit, a deep beat beneath the chaos of the warp. They believe this pulse is the heartbeat of something massive, not dead, not dreaming, simply waiting. It is neither hostile nor kind. It is expectation made real. If true, then the warp is not just a sea. It is a tomb, a vault of dreaming titans, sealed not by death, but by dormancy. And we, in our psychic noise and reckless passion, may be the ones cracking the seal, not with reverence, but with entropy, not through worship, but through evolution. The gods we know are the loudest voices, but the silence beneath them is not empty. It is breathing, it is slow, it is patient, and one day it may wake. And so we arrive at the final and most haunting possibility, that the death of the last god will not be an end, but a beginning. That when the four great powers, Khorne, Tzeentch, Nurgle, and Slaanesh, have run their course, bled the galaxy dry, and collapsed beneath the weight of their own entropy, something else will rise from the void they leave behind. A final god, not an addition to the pantheon, but a replacement, a culmination. This god would not be born of a single emotion. It would be born of the end of emotion, or perhaps of all emotions combined and reconciled. It would not rage like Khorne, scheme like Tzeentch, rot like Nurgle, or seduce like Slaanesh. It would witness. It would endure. It would be what remains when every scream has been screamed and every desire exhausted. Some name this hypothetical entity Nullius, the god of the end. A being not of peace or war, but of cessation. A god whose presence silences demons, dissolves reality, and unhooks time from its axis. In this vision, Nullius is not a destroyer, but a vacuum, a psychic event born not from passion, but from burnout. From a galaxy that can no longer sustain belief, and thus births something beyond it. Others imagine a god of synthesis, a final deity that is not new, but the reintegration of all others, the shattered god made whole, a being that absorbs the four, reconciles their contradictions, and transcends them. Not to erase difference, but to fuse it into unity. The Omega Principle. A god that is at once bloodlust and peace, change and stasis, decay and growth, pleasure and austerity. A god that is not a god at all, but the warp's final form. Consciousness unbound. There are prophecies scrawled in dying worlds and echoed in black holes that speak of the final throne, a place that exists outside of the warp and within it simultaneously, unreachable until the day all other thrones fall. Some madmen say it already has a name, one not yet spoken by any tongue, but felt in the collective death wish of the cosmos, the last prayer of the last man. And what of mortals? What is our role in this final god's coming? We may be the catalysts, our ceaseless wars, our psychic emissions, our desperate search for meaning. These are not just feeding the current gods, they are accelerating their saturation. A god fed too well bursts, and in bursting may seed the final bloom. We are not merely believers, we are compost, fertilizer for something that will grow only when the garden is finally ash. But maybe, just maybe, we have a choice. Not to stop the end, that is a fool's hope, but to shape it, to determine what comes after. If the gods we now fear are symptoms of trauma and fragmentation, then perhaps the final god could be something else, something redemptive, something sane. Or perhaps sanity itself will be the last to die, and the final god will be a mirror, reflecting everything back at us with perfect indifference. In the silence that follows chaos, what voice will remain? It will not scream, it will not lie, it will not rot or tempt or burn. It will simply be, thank you for watching. If you've made it this far, you carry the echoes of forbidden truths. Subscribe for more grimdark speculation, deep lore theory, and the madness that binds us all together. The warp remembers, and so should you.